In February 1839, a rice farmer named Sengbe Pieh was walking along a road in Mende country, in what is now Sierra Leone, when 4 men grabbed him. They tied his right hand to his neck. Within hours, this 25-year-old father of 3 became a commodity, sold from one trader to another until he reached Lomboko, a slave fortress on the Galinas coast controlled by Pedro Blanco, one of the wealthiest slave traders in West Africa. Sengbe had no way of knowing that his capture would spark a legal battle that would reach the United States Supreme Court, be argued by a former president, and become one of the most important freedom suits in American history. He didn't know that the Spanish slavers who bought him would give him a new name, Joseph Cinqué, or that this name would become a symbol of resistance against an institution that had already claimed millions of African lives. All Sengbe knew, in those first terrifying days of captivity, was that he wanted to go home to his wife and children in the village of Mani, and that he would do whatever it took to get there. The Atlantic slave trade had been officially illegal for decades by 1839. Britain outlawed it in 1807. The United States followed in 1808. Spain banned the importation of slaves to its colonies in 1817, and Portugal ended its participation in 1836. But these laws existed mostly on paper. Along the coast of West Africa, the trade continued to thrive, and nowhere more so than at Lomboko. This wasn't some hidden operation. Pedro Blanco ran his enterprise openly, with barracoons that could hold 5,000 people at a time. By 1839, about 2,000 enslaved Africans were being shipped out of the Galinas River annually, despite the British naval patrols that supposedly enforced the treaties. Blanco had built his fortune on a simple calculation. The odds of being caught were low, the profits were astronomical, and the Spanish and Portuguese officials who were supposed to enforce the ban were easily bribed. He lived in palatial buildings on the small islands at the mouth of the Galinas River, surrounded by wives and concubines, while thousands of kidnapped Africans waited in his holding pens for the ships that would carry them across the Atlantic. Sengbe spent several weeks at Lomboko. The conditions were designed to break people. Captives were stripped naked and inspected like livestock. They were beaten. Disease spread rapidly through the overcrowded barracoons. Food and water were rationed to keep people weak enough to control but alive enough to sell. This was where Sengbe met the other men and women who would later be with him on the Amistad. They came from different villages across Mende country and beyond. Some had been kidnapped like Sengbe. Others had been captured in warfare, handed over as debt payment, or sold as punishment for crimes like adultery. Most had been marched for days to reach Lomboko, and now they waited, not knowing where they were going or what would happen to them, but certain that whatever came next would be worse than anything they had experienced before. In April 1839, a Portuguese slave ship called the Tacora arrived at Lomboko. It was built specifically for speed and maneuverability, designed to outrun British patrol vessels. The captain loaded approximately 600 Africans aboard, including Sengbe and the others who would later end up on the Amistad. Then came the Middle Passage. The captives were chained in groups of 5 and packed into the slave hold, a deck below the main deck. One person's head, when lying in rows, was forced upon another person's thigh. Each person had 3 feet 3 inches of headroom. The voyage to Cuba took 10 weeks. The captives testified later that they were kept naked during the crossing, chained into half-seated, half-lying positions. They were brought up on deck occasionally and fed rice. Those who tried to starve themselves, and many did, were whipped and forced to eat. Water supplies ran dangerously low. Disease spread through the unventilated, overcrowded hold. When provisions ran short, the crew would chain 30 to 40 people together, attach a heavy weight, and throw it overboard, dragging everyone into the ocean. Those who died from illness were simply tossed into the water. By the time the Tacora reached Cuba in June 1839, countless people had perished, but Sengbe and about 300 others had survived. The Tacora couldn't simply sail into Havana Harbor. Importing slaves into Cuba was illegal under Spanish law and the treaty with Britain. So the ship waited offshore until darkness fell. Under cover of night, the crew loaded the captives into small boats and brought them ashore at a secluded inlet a few miles from the city. Once on land, the Africans were placed in a barracoon, another holding pen, to await sale. Under Spanish law, these people should have been free the moment they touched Cuban soil. The treaty was clear. Anyone brought to Cuba after 1820 was supposed to be liberated. But the Spanish officials in Havana had perfected a system of fraud. They issued fake documentation claiming the newly arrived Africans were actually Cuban-born slaves, people who had been in the colony since before the ban took effect. This paperwork, easily purchased with the right bribes, transformed a flagrant violation of international law into a seemingly legitimate transaction in the domestic slave trade. 2 Spanish plantation owners came to the barracoon in late June. José Ruiz was 24 years old, carefully selecting workers for his sugar plantation. He ordered the Africans to stand in rows, then inspected their bodies and teeth one by one, the way you might examine horses at a market. Ruiz bought 49 adult men for $450 each. Pedro Montes, 58 years old, selected 4 children, 3 of them girls. Together, Ruiz and Montes purchased 53 people, including Sengbe, and obtained fraudulent passports from the Captain General. These documents listed fake Spanish names for each African and described them as Black Ladenos, Cuban-born slaves being transported legally within the colony. On June 28, 1839, Ruiz and Montes loaded their human cargo aboard a coastal schooner called La Amistad. The name meant friendship in Spanish. The ship was headed for Puerto Príncipe, where the Africans would be resold to work on sugar plantations. The voyage should have taken a few days at most. The Amistad wasn't built as a slave ship. It was a 2-masted schooner of about 120 feet, designed for coastal trading. Because it lacked purpose-built slave quarters, the crew placed some captives in the main hold and others on deck. The Africans had more freedom of movement than they'd had on the Tacora, which would turn out to be a crucial miscalculation by their captors. The conditions aboard were harsh. They received minimal food and water, just 2 potatoes and 1 plantain twice a day, and half a teacup of water morning and evening. One man named Fani later testified that when he asked for more water, he was severely flogged. Powder, salt, and rum were rubbed into his wounds. The scars were still visible months later. The ship's cook seemed to take particular pleasure in tormenting the captives. He would pantomime to them, gesturing that they would be killed and eaten when they reached their destination. Whether he believed this would intimidate them into submission or was simply cruel, the threat had the opposite effect. The Africans decided they had nothing left to lose. On the night of July 2nd, 3 days after leaving Havana, Sengbe Pieh made his move. He'd been working a nail loose from somewhere on the ship, and he used it to pick the padlock on his collar. Once free, he quietly released his companions. They found sugarcane knives stored below deck, long machetes used for harvesting. Then they waited for the right moment. It was a moonless night, very dark. Most of the crew was asleep except the man at the helm. In the pre-dawn hours, the Africans stormed the deck. The ship's captain, Ramon Ferrer, who also owned the vessel, grabbed an oar and tried to fight them off, shouting for help. One crew member cried out, "Murder," before the Africans overwhelmed them. They killed Ferrer and the cook who had threatened them with cannibalism. 2 sailors either jumped overboard or were thrown into the sea and managed to escape in a small boat. 2 of the African captives also died in the fighting. When it was over, the Africans had control of the ship. They kept Ruiz and Montez alive, along with the cabin boy and the enslaved man Antonio who served Ferrer, because they needed someone who could navigate the vessel. The next morning, Sengbe ordered Montez to sail the Amistad east, back to Africa, toward the rising sun. Montez agreed. During the day, he steered east as commanded. But at night, when the Africans couldn't see which direction they were traveling, Montez secretly turned the ship around and headed northwest, toward the American coast. He hoped they would encounter another Spanish vessel that could rescue him and Ruiz and recapture the Africans. What followed was 2 months of zigzagging across the Atlantic. The Amistad wandered between the coasts of Africa and North America on an erratic course, supplies dwindling, more people dying from hunger and thirst. Sengbe and the others couldn't understand why the journey was taking so long. They had no way of knowing they were being deceived, that every night's progress was being undone. Finally, in late August, Montez achieved what he'd been hoping for. The Amistad came close enough to land that some of the Africans went ashore near Montauk Point on Long Island to get fresh water. That's where they were spotted. On August 24, 1839, the U.S. brig Washington, commanded by Lieutenant Thomas Gedney, intercepted the Amistad. Gedney and his crew boarded the vessel and heard Montez and Ruiz's version of events. The 2 Spaniards claimed they were the victims of a mutiny, that these Africans were their legal property, and that they had been violently seized. Gedney placed the Africans under arrest and charged them with mutiny and murder. He also saw an opportunity for profit. Under maritime law at the time, anyone who salvaged a ship and its cargo from danger was entitled to compensation. Gedney claimed salvage rights to the Amistad and its contents, and he specifically valued the Africans as property worth $25,000. The ship was towed to New London, Connecticut, and the Africans were imprisoned in New Haven to await trial. Connecticut still technically allowed slavery in 1839, though it had passed a gradual abolition law decades earlier. If the Amistad had been captured just a few miles east, in New York waters, the Africans would have landed in a free state where different laws might have applied. The case immediately became a sensation. By early September, a New York theater was already staging a play called The Long, Low Black Schooner about the Revolt. Thousands of people paid admission fees to visit the jail and stare at the imprisoned Africans. Newspapers ran extensive coverage, and the story attracted attention from multiple parties, each with their own interests. Lieutenant Gedney and his crew claimed salvage rights. 2 hunters who had encountered some of the Africans on the Long Island shore also claimed they deserved compensation for helping capture them. Ruiz and Montez wanted their property returned. The Spanish government demanded that the United States honor its treaty obligations and send the Africans back to Cuba to stand trial for piracy and murder. President Martin Van Buren, worried about maintaining good relations with Spain and concerned about how the case might affect Southern support for his re-election, sided with the Spanish. His administration prepared a ship to transport the Africans back to Cuba the moment a court ruled in Spain's favor. But the Africans also found allies. Northern abolitionists, led by Louis Tappan and other members of what became known as the Amistad Committee, recognized the case's potential to advance their cause. They raised funds for a legal defense and hired Roger Sherman Baldwin, a prominent attorney from New Haven. The central legal question seemed straightforward at first. Were these people property, as Ruiz and Montes claimed, or were they human beings entitled to their freedom? But answering that question required establishing the facts of their capture and transport. If the Africans had been born in Cuba, as the fraudulent Spanish documents claimed, they might legally be slaves under Cuban law, even if that law was morally abhorrent. If they had been kidnapped from Africa and illegally transported across the Atlantic in violation of multiple treaties, they were free people defending themselves against kidnappers. The abolitionists faced a major obstacle. None of the Africans spoke English, and no one in Connecticut spoke their language. Without a translator, the Africans couldn't tell their story, couldn't explain that they had been kidnapped from Sierra Leone just months earlier, couldn't prove that the Spanish documents were fraudulent. The breakthrough came when the abolitionists found James Covey, a sailor on a British ship who spoke Mende. Suddenly, communication became possible. Sengbe, who became the informal representative of the group, could finally testify. He told Baldwin and the court about his life in Mani, about being captured on the road, about Lomboko and the horrific voyage on the Tacora, about the barracoon in Havana and the conditions aboard the Amistad. His testimony, delivered through Covey's translation, was detailed and consistent. He described specific places, named the traders who had held them, explained how the revolt had happened and why. Other Africans corroborated his account. A man named Grabeau, who spoke 4 African languages, told how he was caught on the road going to buy clothes. A young boy named Kali said he was stolen in the street. A girl named Teme described how men broke into her mother's house at night and took her prisoner. She never saw her mother or brother again. The first trial began in Hartford in September 1839 before a circuit court, which quickly determined it lacked jurisdiction because the alleged crimes occurred on a Spanish ship in Spanish waters. The case was transferred to the U.S. District Court in New Haven. Judge Andrew Judson heard arguments beginning January 7, 1840. Roger Sherman Baldwin built his case on a simple premise. The Africans had been kidnapped and transported illegally. The treaty between Britain and Spain, and Spain's own laws, prohibited importing Africans to Cuba after 1820. The documents claiming these people were Cuban-born slaves were obviously fraudulent. These were recently captured Africans who spoke no Spanish, who had no knowledge of Cuban culture, who could describe in detail their lives in Sierra Leone and the horrors of the Middle Passage. They had been fighting not to escape legal bondage, but to resist illegal kidnapping. Under international law, they had every right to use force to regain their freedom. Sengbe's testimony became the dramatic centerpiece of the 5-day trial. Through James Covey, he described his capture, the conditions at Lomboko, the Middle Passage aboard the Tacora, and the revolt on the Amistad. He spoke with authority and emotion, his intelligence and dignity evident even through translation. When asked who had led the revolt, he stood and declared through Covey that he had done it, that he had freed himself and his companions because they were determined to go home. The prosecution argued that regardless of how the Africans arrived in Cuba, Ruiz and Montes had purchased them in good faith with proper documentation from Spanish authorities. The United States had treaty obligations to Spain that required respecting Spanish property claims. But Baldwin and the abolitionists had done their homework. They presented evidence that Spanish officials routinely falsified documents to disguise illegally imported Africans as Cuban-born slaves. They brought forward testimony about Lomboko and the Takora. They demonstrated that the Africans' detailed accounts of their kidnapping were credible and consistent. On January 13, 1840, Judge Judson issued his ruling. The Africans had been illegally kidnapped and illegally enslaved. They were not property. They were free people who had defended themselves against their kidnappers. They would not be returned to Cuba to face murder charges. Instead, they should be released and given passage back to Africa. The courtroom erupted. For the Africans who had been imprisoned for months in a country where they didn't speak the language, surrounded by a legal system they didn't understand, it seemed like the nightmare might finally be ending. But the fight wasn't over. The Spanish government immediately appealed, and the Van Buren administration, still worried about diplomatic relations and Southern political support, backed Spain's appeal. The case went to the Circuit Court, which upheld Judson's decision. Van Buren appealed again, this time to the Supreme Court. This is where the case took on even greater significance. The abolitionists needed someone with the stature and skill to argue before the highest court in the land. They found him in John Quincy Adams, the 73-year-old former president who was then serving as a congressman from Massachusetts. Adams had been fighting the gag rule in Congress, which prevented anti-slavery petitions from being heard. He was known as Old Man Eloquent for his oratory skills, and he had extensive experience arguing before the Supreme Court. Initially hesitant, Adams eventually agreed to take the case, believing it would be his last great service to the country. The Supreme Court hearing began February 22, 1841. The government's case, argued by Attorney General Henry Gilpin, rested on treaty obligations and property rights. The Spanish documents said these were slaves. The United States had treaties with Spain requiring it to respect Spanish property. The court had no authority to question the validity of documents issued by a foreign government. Adams and Baldwin had to overcome these arguments while navigating the political reality that the court itself included justices who owned slaves. Adams's argument, delivered over several days with a pause due to the death of one justice, was masterful. He didn't deny the treaty obligations. Instead, he reframed the entire case. These weren't slaves who had mutinied against lawful owners. These were free people who had been kidnapped. The Spanish documents were fraudulent, and everyone involved knew it. The Africans weren't asking for special treatment. They were simply asking for what the law already provided: the right to defend themselves against illegal enslavement. Adams invoked the Declaration of Independence, pointing dramatically to a copy hanging in the courtroom. He accused Van Buren of abusing executive power by trying to rush the Africans back to Cuba before the courts could rule. He argued that sympathy and political expediency had replaced justice in the government's handling of the case. The United States, he said, had a choice. It could honor its own stated principles about liberty and natural rights, or it could side with slave traders and kidnappers for the sake of diplomatic convenience. On March 9, 1841, Justice Joseph Story delivered the court's decision. By a vote of 7-1, the Supreme Court affirmed the lower court rulings. The Africans had been kidnapped and illegally transported. They had never been slaves under any legitimate law. They had the right to use force to escape their captors. They were free. The decision was narrow in some ways. The court ruled that the United States government had no obligation to pay for the Africans' return to Africa, which the lower court had ordered. But the fundamental question was resolved. After 18 months of imprisonment in the United States, after years since their initial capture in Sierra Leone, after the horrors of Lomboko and the Takora and the Amistad, Sengbe Pieh and his companions were finally, legally, free. Freedom presented its own challenges. 35 Africans had survived the entire ordeal. 18 had died during the Middle Passage, during the Revolt, or while imprisoned in Connecticut. Now, the survivors needed money to get home. The U.S. government wasn't going to pay for it. The abolitionists organized a fundraising campaign. The Africans, still living in Connecticut, participated in speaking tours where they demonstrated their English language skills, read from the Bible, and sang songs. They had learned English during their imprisonment, taught by missionaries and abolitionists who saw education as part of the fight against slavery. These tours raised the necessary funds and also served a propaganda purpose, demonstrating that Africans were intelligent, dignified human beings capable of learning and achievement, directly contradicting the racist ideology that justified slavery. On November 25, 1841, Sengbe and 34 other survivors boarded the ship Gentleman, bound for Sierra Leone. 3 more people died during the voyage home. James Covey, the interpreter who had been so crucial to their legal defense, accompanied them, as did 5 white missionaries who planned to establish a Christian mission. They arrived in Sierra Leone in January 1842. For the Africans, returning home should have been joyous. Instead, they found a region torn apart by civil war, the kind of conflict that had helped fuel the slave trade in the first place. Most of the survivors vanished from the historical record after their return. Sengbe maintained contact with the mission for a while, but he eventually left to trade along the coast. Reports about his later life are sketchy and often contradictory. Some said he moved to Jamaica. Others claimed he became a merchant or a chief. There were even rumors that he became a slave trader himself, though historians have found no credible evidence for this claim. What seems most likely is that Sengbe tried to return to his village, tried to rebuild some version of the life that had been stolen from him. But his wife and children were gone, reportedly killed in the ongoing warfare that plagued the region. He may have returned to the mission near the end of his life. One account suggests that in 1879, a dying Sengbe came back to request a Christian burial, though this too is difficult to verify. The ambiguity of Sengbe's later life shouldn't diminish what he accomplished. His act of resistance aboard the Amistad, and the legal battle that followed, had reverberations far beyond his personal story. The case became a rallying point for the abolitionist movement at a time when it desperately needed momentum. The 1830s had seen internal divisions and waning public interest in the anti-slavery cause. The Amistad case brought different factions of abolitionists together behind a common cause. It generated widespread media attention and public sympathy. It demonstrated that the legal system could, under the right circumstances, rule against slavery and in favor of black freedom. The trial also exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of American slavery. The United States had officially banned the Atlantic slave trade, had even passed laws allowing the Navy to intercept slave ships. But when confronted with actual victims of the illegal trade, the government sided with the slavers. Van Buren's administration was willing to send free people back into slavery to preserve diplomatic relations and maintain Southern political support. It took the intervention of abolitionists, the courage of the Africans themselves, and the moral authority of a former president to force the system to live up to its stated principles. The Amistad case revealed how the institution of slavery corrupted everything it touched. Spanish officials in Cuba routinely falsified documents to disguise illegal slave trading as legitimate commerce. American naval officers saw kidnapped Africans not as people in need of help, but as potential salvage profits. A sitting president was willing to circumvent the legal process to return free people to bondage. The case showed how slavery required constant dishonesty, how it demanded that everyone involved pretend not to see the obvious truth that these were kidnapped people, not property. The Africans' testimony made it impossible to maintain that pretense. When Sengbe stood in court and described being captured on the road, when other Africans told detailed stories about their villages and families, when they spoke through translators about Lomboko and the Takora, they forced everyone in the courtroom to confront the reality of what the Atlantic slave trade actually was: industrial-scale kidnapping and brutalization. The legal precedent the case established was significant but limited. The Supreme Court ruled that illegally enslaved people had the right to fight for their freedom. But it didn't question the legality of slavery itself in places where it was permitted by law. The decision applied to the specific circumstances of the Amistad Africans, but didn't extend to the millions of people already enslaved in the United States. Southern slaveholders understood this and actually supported the verdict, recognizing that it didn't threaten their property rights in people who had been born into slavery or enslaved under laws that U.S. courts recognized as legitimate. The case was less revolutionary than it might seem. What it did do was provide ammunition for abolitionists and inspiration for others fighting slavery. It showed that the system could be challenged, that enslaved people could win their freedom through the courts. When Sengbe stood before judges and declared through his translator that he had led the revolt, that he had fought for his freedom and had every right to do so, he was asserting a basic human dignity that slavery sought to deny. The fact that the highest court in the land agreed with him, even in this limited circumstance, mattered. The Amistad case also highlighted the crucial role of black activism in the fight against slavery. While white abolitionists like Lewis Tappan and John Quincy Adams receive much of the historical credit, the United Missionary Society, a black organization founded by James W.C. Pennington, raised the money that actually paid for the Africans' return home. James Covey, a formerly enslaved African who had gained his freedom, made the entire legal defense possible by serving as translator. The Africans themselves participated in the fundraising tours that financed their voyage home, becoming public advocates for their own freedom in the process. The case demonstrated that black people weren't just victims waiting to be rescued, but active participants in the struggle for liberation. The legacy of the Amistad extends beyond the immediate outcomes. Schools and historical sites established by the missionaries who accompanied the Africans back to Sierra Leone became important educational institutions in that country. The Hartford School for Girls in Moyamba and the Albert Academy in Freetown trace their origins to the aftermath of the Amistad case. American missionary efforts in Africa, which would have profound and complicated impacts over the following decades, gained momentum from the relationships established during the Amistad affair. For better and worse, the case became a founding moment in American evangelical engagement with Africa. In the United States, the Amistad case remained a reference point in debates over slavery. Abolitionists invoked it to argue that the institution was fundamentally lawless, built on kidnapping and violence that even pro-slavery courts sometimes had to acknowledge. The case showed that international treaties against the slave trade were being systematically violated with the complicity of government officials at every level. It provided a template for how legal activism could challenge slavery, even in a system weighted heavily in favor of slaveholders. When the Civil War finally came 20 years later, and when slavery was finally abolished by the 13th Amendment, the Amistad case stood as an early example of how the courts could be forced to recognize black humanity and freedom. Sengbe Pieh's face now appears on Sierra Leone's 5,000 Leone banknote, a recognition of his significance to that nation's history. Statues and sculptures commemorate him in New Haven and Hartford, Connecticut, marking the places where he and his companions were imprisoned and where their case was first heard. The Amistad story has been told and retold in books, plays, poems, operas, and films. It remains a powerful narrative of resistance and the fight for freedom. But the focus on the dramatic elements of the story, the rebellion and the trial, sometimes obscures the human reality. Sengbe Pieh was a rice farmer who wanted to go home to his family. He never chose to become a symbol or a historical figure. He was forced into that role by a system that saw him as merchandise, that would have worked him to death on a Cuban sugar plantation if he hadn't been willing to risk everything to fight back. The violence of the revolt on the Amistad was not the original violence in this story. The original violence was the kidnapping, the march to Lomboko, the barracoons, the Middle Passage, the plan to sell human beings like cattle. What Sengbe and the others did on that July night in 1839 was respond to violence with the force necessary to end it. The fact that they then spent 18 months fighting in American courts for recognition of what should have been self-evident, their right to freedom, shows how deeply the ideology of slavery had infected the legal and political systems that were supposed to protect human rights. The Amistad case succeeded because the Africans' situation was so clear-cut, their kidnapping so recent, their illegal transport so well documented, that even judges who supported slavery couldn't ignore the facts. But for every Sengbe Pieh who won his freedom in court, there were thousands who didn't, who lived and died in bondage without ever getting the chance to tell their stories to sympathetic lawyers or before judges willing to listen. The Amistad case didn't end slavery. It didn't even seriously threaten it. What it did was create a moment where the machinery of slavery was forced to reveal itself, where the lies and fraudulent documents and corrupt officials and legal sophistry couldn't quite hide what everyone already knew. This was a system built on kidnapping and terror, maintained through violence, and dependent on everyone agreeing to pretend it was somehow legitimate. Sengbe Pieh refused to pretend. He killed his captors, seized their ship, and then stood in American courtrooms and demanded his freedom. He forced judges and lawyers and politicians to decide whether they would honor their stated principles about liberty and human rights, or whether those principles only applied to white people. For once, in this one case, the principles won. That victory mattered to the 35 Africans who finally made it home. It mattered to the abolitionists who saw proof that the legal system could sometimes deliver justice. It mattered to enslaved people throughout the Americas who learned that resistance was possible, that white courts could sometimes rule in favor of black freedom. But it's worth remembering what victory actually looked like. Sengbe went home to find his family dead, his village torn apart by war, his life irreparably broken by the years stolen from him. He lived out his remaining years in a country still ravaged by the slave trade that had destroyed his life. The American missionaries who accompanied him home brought Christianity and Western education, which had their own complicated legacies of cultural imperialism and colonization. The British would colonize Sierra Leone entirely within decades. The United States would continue to enslave millions of people for another 24 years after the Amistad verdict, and racial oppression would persist long after slavery formally ended. Sengbe Pieh's story is often told as triumph, and in many ways it was. He survived capture, the Middle Passage, the Amistad Revolt, and the American legal system. He won his freedom when the odds were overwhelmingly against him. He became a symbol of resistance that inspired others. But his story is also one of devastating loss, of a life interrupted and never fully restored, of justice delayed and compromised, of freedom won at tremendous cost. When we remember Sengbe Pieh, we should remember both things: the extraordinary courage it took to fight back against his captors and pursue his freedom through a foreign legal system, and the tragedy of needing to fight at all, of having his life stolen, his family destroyed, his home rendered unrecognizable. We should remember that the Amistad case was exceptional precisely because it succeeded, because most people caught in the machinery of the Atlantic slave trade never got their day in court, never had abolitionists rally to their defense, never had a former president argue for their freedom. The Amistad case became famous because it had a relatively happy ending, at least compared to the typical fate of enslaved Africans. But that exceptionality is exactly what makes it important to study. It shows what the system normally prevented: enslaved people telling their own stories, being recognized as individuals with histories and families and rights, having their humanity acknowledged by courts and governments. The system worked precisely because it usually denied all of that, because it reduced people to property and made their resistance invisible or illegal. Sengbe Pieh broke through that invisibility. His voice, translated through James Covey, rang out in American courtrooms and told a truth that slavery depended on suppressing: that enslaved people were people, that their captivity was a crime, that they had every right to fight for their freedom. The fact that it took a Supreme Court decision to establish these obvious truths tells you everything about how deeply slavery had corrupted the American legal system. The fact that the court did eventually rule correctly in this one case shows that the corruption wasn't absolute, that the system could sometimes be forced to confront its own contradictions. Sengbe Pieh, the rice farmer from Mani who became Joseph Cinqué, the rebel leader who became a legal plaintiff, the symbol of resistance who just wanted to go home, died sometime around 1879. He was about 65 years old. His life spanned the peak and beginning of the end of the Atlantic slave trade. He lived to see the American Civil War and the abolition of slavery in the United States, though whether news of these events reached him in Sierra Leone is unknown. What we know for certain is that he refused to accept his enslavement, that he fought back when fighting back seemed suicidal, that he stood before the highest court in America and won his freedom. We know that his case inspired others and embarrassed a government that claimed to oppose the slave trade while enabling it. We know that his victory was incomplete, that going home didn't restore what had been taken from him, that justice delayed is justice diminished. We know that he was one person among millions who suffered under the Atlantic slave trade, and that his story became famous precisely because it was unusual, because he survived and won and got to tell his story. For every Sengbe Pieh whose name we remember, there were countless others whose names are lost, who died at Lomboko or during the Middle Passage or on plantations, who never got to fight back or whose resistance was crushed, who never had their humanity recognized by the systems that enslaved them. Remembering Sengbe Pieh means remembering them too, means understanding that his exceptional victory highlights the ordinary horror that was the Atlantic slave trade. Means recognizing that the freedom he won was the bare minimum of what he and millions of others deserved from the beginning. The right to live their lives, raise their families, and never be treated as property at all.